Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. As I've said before, many podcasts can put their promotion and cup rattling halfway through or towards the end. But because if I'm hoping you're asleep before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. The show is brought to you as always by the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from a lot of people how valuable they find the show and how much it's helpful it is to them. And those of you that help me to keep the show running and help me fund my expenses are very much appreciated. You're doing your part to help me to look after others, and it's a fantastic thing for people to be willing to do. You don't have to pay, but as part of a larger community, it's a good thing to do to help look after others. The latest of these people helping us out is Lizzie, who signed up on Patreon. Thank you very much for that. She joins a group of people who have been around for a while and are doing a lot to help me keep this show going. And if you're somebody who would like to and has the means to help me to keep the show going, please take a look at patreon.com/sleepytimetales or even patron.sleepytimetales.net at the link in the show notes or from the website to see what you can get as a supporter. There are real rewards from as little as $2 a month, over and above the knowledge that you are helping thousands of fellow insomniacs to get a good night's sleep. If a monthly sign-up is a little bit much for you, there are other ways you can support the show as well. There's the Patreon. Besides the Patreon, there's the tip jar, the merchandise store. There is the Audible trial link you can hit, and the merchandise store. But even more important than financial help, the other thing you can do to help the show and help other sleepless people is just to tell people about it. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. And if you recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. So you can tag me at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. And I think that's it for tonight. I'm going to keep this short. Last thing is we obviously need to mention the music, which I have to do every week because it is such an important part of the show. The song is Un Désert by Komiku. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked their website in the show notes, as they've got some very cool stuff that they release under various names that I recommend taking a look at. Thank you for taking the time and listening to this, and we're back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It's a bit of a strange idea after all. It's a podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find that you lie awake at night with your mind spinning in emotions and turmoil with the anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself just not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I'm someone who has always struggled to sleep. My parents had sleepless nights with me for many years, and even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, sleep was always a struggle for me. I discovered embarrassingly late in life the tendency for droning voices, especially male ones, to act almost like a tranquilizer for me. I used to sort of lean into my insomnia at night, and I used to put the headphones on and listen to podcasts in the dark, assuming that I was going to be lying awake listening to them all night. And then I'd suddenly find myself waking up having missed everything that I was trying to listen to. I realized eventually it was the podcasts themselves that were doing it for me, so I started listening to others specifically for the purpose of helping me sleep. And then I discovered that there are ones out there that are actually intended for that. I found one in particular that worked very well for me, but when I recommended it for others, it didn't work for other people. What was often the case is they didn't like the narrator's voice, or they didn't like the sort of method of delivering the story. So I thought to myself, I think I've got a boring, droning voice, so maybe I can do something similar but a little bit different and see if I can reach other people that this particular podcast couldn't reach. And so I started up Sleepy Time Tales. Now every episode starts with this long intro. There's a little bit in the beginning, right before the promotional bit, and then this longer section that goes on usually roughly for about 15 minutes. It's something that if I'm going to get a complaint about the show, it is going to be this particular intro. But it is very important. It's here for two reasons. The first one is I feel like I need to sort of make the case for new listeners. If you've just discovered the show and you're not too familiar with sleep podcasts and you're not too sure exactly what the concept is and the sort of how to really engage with it, I need to make a case for it for you. And because it is a bit of an odd idea, I've got to be frank and sort of explain to you how I think it's helpful to engage with. And for people who've been listening for the show for a while, it serves a very different and equally important purpose. In a lot of ways, this is intended kind of like a guided meditation that just drifts you to sleep and helps you drift to sleep rather than drifting into enlightenment. And this intro, which is usually pretty much the same but slightly different every time, I hit the important bits, but I do re-record this every week. Because it's the same but a bit different, the idea is that you kind of engage with it, but don't really engage with it once you've heard it for a few times. And that way it keeps your mind busy and active, but not so busy and active that when sleep comes for you, you resist it. If all goes well, you'll be asleep by the end of this intro. I've even got one listener who told me the story that I thought was incredible once, that they forgot their headphones at home. And they're a long-time listener of the show, so they just thought, let me just deal with this. They lay in the dark, and they actually just basically remembered this whole intro and managed to fall asleep. So I do find it absolutely hilarious and delightful that this show is so effective that you don't even need to listen to it for it to work for you. So shout outs to that person. I mentioned them being in a episode before, and it still delights me. And when I tell people that story, it gets crazy laughs. The idea that I'm so happy at being so boring that you don't even need to listen to me for me to help you go to sleep. Anyway, that's a nice sideline on that one. So obviously the primary thing is I need to explain the show to listeners. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of ways to engage with the show. For me, when I listen to my sleep podcasts and things at night, I need a story or an event that lets me keep my mind on something specific, on some point or series or event or actions to stop my mind from spinning out into stress and anxiety, which are the big enemies of my sleep. I need to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of sleep when it comes for me. Another big thing these days for people is white noise. So for some people may need literal white noise or pink noise or the sound of wind in the trees or the ocean or running a river. And maybe some people just need a boring dude droning on, talking nonsense and telling a story that's not particularly exciting. However you need to engage with the show, though, that is what it's for. I'm here to look after you and to engage with you on your terms. This may kind of seem like a one-way street, but in a lot of ways, this is a cooperation. I am here to keep you company, but at the end of the day, it's up to you how you deal with me, whether you deal with me at all, to be honest. Tonight's story is Out of the Fog, A Story of the Sea by Charles K. Ober. It's a story of a young man who starts fishing, a North American young boy in the late 19th, early 20th century. On his second trip to sea, he and his boatmate get lost at sea for 8 days. And he has a bit of a religious experience, and he falls off the wagon and then sort of rediscovers his faith. And it's a fairly interesting story, a tale of adventure and danger that's being told in first person, is going to end well, or somewhat well. And sort of the inconsistencies of how people deal with things. Interesting story, definitely, I think, worth your time if you reach it. But whatever the story is about, the main thing is that you don't try to force your sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the story as I tell you on the sound of my voice, and when sleep comes for you, just let it happen. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first time listening to the story, the odds are actually pretty good this won't work for you. I recommend giving it at least 3 nights to try, and I would make the same recommendation for anything that you try to do. Any kind of meditation or white noise thing or any other sleep podcast that you listen to, I do suggest giving a solid 3 nights to sort of get over that hump, that sort of natural resistance, especially these ones where someone like me is telling you a story because you don't really know that you can trust me. I'm some guy you don't know talking to you in your sleep, and who knows what I'm going to be whispering to you. So it will make sense if you're a little bit hesitant. I do promise you will always be safe with me, but, trust is earned. What I do also do with my podcast is sometimes I need more than one. Sometimes an hour or 2 hours just isn't enough. So what I do is I have a whole bunch of every show that I listen to downloaded, and then I start with the latest episode, and then I just let them run all night. Because often at the moment I'm actually falling asleep fine, but it's waking up at 3 a.m. that's the issue for me. And when I wake up, my stream is still running, and I pop my earbuds in if they've fallen out, and I go back to sleep again. Sometimes I even wake up 30 or 60 minutes before my alarm, and I do the same thing. And I've got to tell you, sometimes that falling asleep 30 minutes or 60 minutes before the alarm is the most deeply satisfying part of the night. It feels like I get half my sleep done in that short time. I don't know what it is, but there's just something in allowing yourself to relax right before the alarm that is just satisfying on a primal and very deep level. But however you engage with the show and whatever time of night you're listening to, whether you're struggling to fall asleep or you're awake in the middle of the night, the important thing is you need to try to relax. If you're new to this show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So give it a chance. That's the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. And I need you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep, and the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath, forgive the fact that you can't sleep, and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up and inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy, but it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by the stress of life and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Out of the Fog, A Story of the Sea by Charles K. Ober. Introduction by Dr. Wilfred T. Grenfell. Forward. Since I'm permitted to consider myself in some way responsible for this narrative's being put on record, it is with the very heartiest goodwill that I accept the publisher's kind invitation to write a brief foreword to it. I have, during 20 years, been working against a problem that I recognized called for all, yes, and more than I had to give it. For I have been endeavoring, through my own imperfect attainments, to translate into undeniable language on the Labrador coast the message of God's personal fatherhood over and love for his humblest of his creatures. During these years, often of overwork, I have considered it worthwhile to lay aside time and energy and strength to improve the charting and pilot directions of our devious and sometimes dangerous waterways. By how much more gladly I shall naturally avail myself of any chance by which to contribute to the knowledge of that seemingly ever-evasive pathway leading to that which to me is the supreme motive power of human life, faith in the divine Redeemer and Master. The best helps to reach the haven we are in search of, over the unblazed trails of Labrador, are ever the tracks of those who have found the way before us. Just such to me is the simple and delightful story of Mr. Ober's. It has my most hearty prayers for his unprecedented circulation. Wilfred T. Grenfell. Old Salts. The lure of the sea prevailed, and at 19 I shipped for a 4 months fishing trip on the Newfoundland banks. These banks are not the kind that slope towards some gentle stream where the wary fisherman can rest between bites, protected from the sun by the shade of an overhanging tree. They are 30 to 40 fathoms beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, 1,000 miles out from the Massachusetts coast. The life that had long appealed to my imagination now came in with a shock and a realism that was in part a disillusionment, and in part an intense satisfaction of some of my primal instincts and cravings. Old salts are more picturesque and companionable spinning yarns about the stove in a shoemaker's shop than they are when one is obliged to live, eat, and sleep with them for 4 months in the crowded forecastle of a fishing schooner. An ocean storm is a sublime spectacle, witnessed from a position of safety on the land, but a storm on the ocean, experienced in its very vortex from the deck of a tiny fishing boat, is thrilling beyond description. Ships that pass in the night make interesting reading, but if they pass near you in a foggy night on the banks, they are better than the muezzin of the Muslim in reminding a man that it is time to pray. I recall with vividness in the scene on such a night and still feel the compelling power of the panic in the voice of the mild-mannered old sea dog on anchor watch, as he yelled down the companionway, "All hands on deck." In 6 seconds we were all there, and there was the great hulk of a 2,000-ton ship looming up out of the night. She had evidently sighted our little craft just in time to change her course, and was passing us with not more than 150 feet to spare. I can see them tonight, as they vanished into the fog. 3 men and a big Newfoundland dog, looking over the rail and down on us who, a moment before, were going to die. Storm, fog, icebergs, cold, exposure, the alert and strenuous life, with his own life in the forfeit of failure, are a part of the normal experience of a deep-sea fisherman. Two members of our crew were father and son, Uncle Ike Patch and his son Frank. The old man had been a fisherman in his youth, but had been on shore for 30 years. When we were making up our crew, Frank caught the fishing fever and wanted to go, and his father decided to go along with him. They were out in their dory one foggy day, and when the boats came back to the vessel from hauling their trawls, Uncle Ike and Frank were missing. We rang the bell, fired our small cannon, shouted and sent boats out after them. As night came on, we were huddled together in the forecastle wondering about their fate, while the old fishermen told stories of the fog and the fearful toll of human life. It seemed a terrible thing for the old man and his boy to be out there, drifting no one knew where. And though we were accustomed to danger, there was a gloomy crew and little sleep on our schooner that night. In the morning, the weather cleared, and soon our missing boat came alongside. We received them as men alive from the dead. They had found shelter on another fishing vessel that happened to be lying at anchor not more than 2 or 3 miles away. There was reason for our solicitude, for we knew very well that a large proportion of the men who get adrift in the fog are never found alive. Shortly before this experience, we had spoken a Gloucester vessel and learnt that her crew had picked up, a short time before, one of the boats of a Provincetown schooner that had been adrift 4 days. One of the 2 men was dead and the other insane. Each day brought its own dangers, which the fishermen met as part of the day's work, thinking little of them when they were past, and ready for whatever another day might bring. But 4 months is a long time to be out of sight of land, on a fresh fish and salthouse diet with molasses instead of sugar in your tea, and fresh water too much needed for drinking purposes to waste in personal ablutions. We all swore that we would never go to sea again, and when after gliding into the harbour in the night, we looked, one clear September morning, on the seemingly unnatural green of the grass and trees of the old North Shore, I said to myself, "This is God's country, if there ever was one, and I, for one, will never be out of sight of it again." But I had tasted fog and brine, and the landlubber's lot was too monotonously tame for me. The next spring saw me on deck of the same schooner headed for the Newfoundland banks and the home of the codfish and the fog. A seafaring ancestry and a boyhood spent within the sound of the surf doubtless had much to do with my love of the salt water. My grandfather was one of 6 brothers who were sea captains, and our father had clung to the north shore of Massachusetts Bay almost since the first white settler had moored his bark in that vicinity, more than 200 years before. My boyhood home was originally a fishing town, since changed to manufacturing, and was fragrant with the traditions of the sea. Many of the neighborhood homes in which I visited as a boy had souvenirs of the ocean displayed on the mantelpiece or on the everlasting solitude of the parlor table. There were great conch shells that a boy could put to his ear and hear the surf roaring on the beaches from which they had been taken. Articles made of sandalwood, curiously wrought things under glass, miniature pagodas, silk scarfs, bow-legged idols, and a wonderful model of the good ship Dolphin or some other equally staunch craft, in which the breadwinner, father or son, had sailed on some eventful voyage. These had all been brought from overseas, I was told, and this gave me the impression that overseas must be a very rich and interesting place. But the souvenirs of the sea were not as interesting to me as its survivors. We had in our town, and especially in our end of it, which was called the Cove, a choice assortment of old sea dogs who had sailed every sea and every clime, had seen the world in fact, and were not averse, under the stimulus of good listeners, to telling all they knew about it, and sometimes a little more. Scattered through the cove were many little shoemakers' shops, into which, especially in the long winter evenings, these old salts would drift. There around the little cylinder stove with its leather-chipped fire, leaking a fragrance of the memory of which makes me homesick as I write about it, they would swap their stories of the sea, many of which had originally been based on fact. These old derelicts, and some of the younger seafaring men were better than dime store novels to us boys, for we could always question them and draw out another story. Some of them were unconscious heroes who had often risked their lives for their comrades and the vessel owners, and for the support and comfort of their families. No dangers or hardships have seemed too great to be undertaken or endured. We boys held these old salts in high esteem and never forgot to give each his appropriate title of captain or skipper, as the case may be. We also occasionally had some fun with them. We never thought of any of them as bad men, though some of them, by their own testimony, had lived wild and reckless lives. One or two, according to persistent rumour, had carried out cargoes of New England rum and brought back shiploads of black ivory from the west coast of Africa. Not a few of them were picturesquely profane. Old skipper Tom Bowman had a very original oath, Tender-eyed Satan, which he must have copyrighted, as he was the only one I ever heard use it. We boys would sometimes bait him, provoking him to exasperation that we might hear it in all its original force and fervour. We knew his habits well. He eked out a scanty sustenance by fishing off the shore, and would frequently come in on the ebb tide and leave his boat halfway up the beach, going home to dinner, and returning when the flood tide had about reached his boat to bring it up to its moorings. So one day we dug a honey pot by the side of his boat, at the very spot where we knew he would approach it, covered over with dried seaweed, and about the time he was due we were lying out of sight, but within earshot, behind the rocks. He drifted down, at peace with all the world, went in over the tops of his rubber boots, and then, for one blissful moment, we had our reward. Some of these old salts were so thoroughly salted, being drenched with the brine of many stormy voyages, that they kept in good condition well beyond their allotted time of over 70. Some were of uncertain age, but were evidently well beyond the century mark, as proved by the aggregate time consumed on their many voyages, the stories of which they had reiterated with such convincing detail. One of these, Captain Sam Morris, was patiently stalked by the boys through a long season of yarn spinning, careful tally being kept. When the tale was complete, the boys closed in on him. "How old are you, Captain Sam?" "Oh, I don't know. I ain't kept count." "Are you 70? "A swan, I don't know." "Well, you were on the old Dove with Skipper Jimmy Stone, weren't you?" "Sartin." "You were on the Constitution when she fought the Guerriere, weren't you?" How could he deny it? "Well, weren't you with Captain Lovett on 4 of his 3-year trading voyages to Australia and China?" "Of course I was." "How about those trips around the Horn on the clipper ship Mary Jane from 49 to 55? "I was there." They kept relentlessly on down the list and then showed him the tally, allowing for infancy and abbreviated boyhood on land and the time they had known him since he had quit the sea. He was 135 years old. The showing did not disconcert him, however. He was interested, but he had told these stories so often and had come to believe each of them so implicitly that he could not doubt them in the aggregate. He simply exclaimed, "Well, I'll be darned. I feel like a young chap of 60. But while some of these old sailors liked to spin yarns and some had their frailties, there were, as a rule, strong characters, rugged, honest, courageous, unselfish, real men, in fact, whose sterling qualities stood out in strong contrast against the unreality of the many timid and non-effective lives around them. It was not their romancing, but their reality and the achieving power of their lives that appealed to me as a boy, and I was drawn to the kind of life that had helped to produce such men. Then, too, the ocean itself, with its immensity, its mystery, its moods, the danger in it, and the man's work in mastering it, was almost irresistibly attractive to me. On graduating from high school, I declined my father's offer to send me to college, thinking that the life I had in view did not require a college education. Then he made me a very attractive business proposition, but it looked to me like slavery, and what I wanted most was freedom. My father and mother were both Christians, but I had become skeptical, profane, and reckless of public opinion, I had left home for a boarding house in the same town at 18, and at 19 I'd slipped the moorings and was heading out to sea. Adrift. My second trip to the banks was made in response to the same kind of impulse as that which drives the nomad out of his winter quarters in the springtime, or brings the wild geese back to their summer feeding grounds. To one who really loves the ocean, the return to it after a period of exile on the land is an indescribable satisfaction. There was at least one of our crew who experienced this emotion as our staunch little craft turned her nose to the blue water, and with all sails set and lee rail almost under water, leapt away from the petty restrictions of the shore into the practically limitless expanse of the Atlantic. In a week we were on the fishing grounds, and sentiment gave way to business. Our schooner was a trawler, equipped with 6 dories and a crew of 15, including the skipper, the cook, the boy, and 2 men for each boat. Each trawl had 1,000 hooks, a strong ground line 6,000 feet long with a smaller line 2.5 feet in length, with hook attached at every fathom. These hooks were baited and the trawl was set each night. The 6 trawls stretched away from the vessel like the spokes from the hubs of a wheel, the buoy marking the outer anchor of each trawl being over a mile away. I was captain of a dory this year, passing as a seasoned fisherman with my experience of the year before. My helper or bowman was John Hogan, a young Irishman about my own age, red-headed but green at the fishing business. John's mother kept a little oasis for thirsty neighbors in a city adjacent to my hometown, and his father was a man of unsteady habits. But John was a good fellow, active and willing, and though he had not inherited a rugged constitution, he could pull a steady stroke. Soon after we reached the banks, a storm swept our decks and nearly carried away our boats. As a result, the dories, particularly my own, were severely strained and leaked badly. For 2 weeks, however, we had no fog, but on the morning of the 2nd of June, just as we went over the schooner's side and shaped our course for our outer buoy, a bank of fog with an edge as perpendicular as the side of a house moved down on us like a great glacier, though much more rapidly, shutting us in and everything else from out of sight. It was ugly and thick, as if all the fog factories from Grand Manan to Labrador had been working overtime for the 2 weeks before, and had sent their whole output in one consignment. We had just passed our inner buoy when the fog struck us, but we kept on for the outer buoy as was customary in foggy weather, since it was safer to get that and pull in toward the vessel, rather than take the inner buoy, pull out, and find ourselves with a boatload of fish in ugly weather over a mile from the vessel. We had our bearings. I had often found the buoy in the fog and believed that we could do it again. We kept on rowing and knew that we had rowed far enough, though we had not counted the strokes, but we found nothing. Guess we have drifted too far to leeward, pulled up to windward a little. That's strange, we must have passed it. This blamed fog is so thick. What's that over there? We zigzagged back and forth for some time and then realized that we had missed it and must go back to the vessel and get our inner buoy. This seemed easy, but we found that it is as important to have a point of departure as it is to have a point of destination. And not knowing just where we were, we could not head to our boat to where the vessel was. We shouted and listened, rowed this way and that way, but not a sound came to us through the fog, although we knew that the boy must be at his post ringing the bell, so that the boats could hark their way back to the vessel. I learned afterward that the tide that morning was exceptionally strong. I had noted its direction and made allowance for it before leaving the schooner. But we were where the Gulf Stream and the Arctic Current are not very far apart, and the resulting tides are strong and changeable. We were in the grip of 2 great elemental and relentless forces, the impenetrable fog cutting off all our communications, and the strong ocean current sweeping us away into the uninhabited waste of waters. From my experience of the year before, I knew what it meant to be lost in the fog on the banks, practically in mid-ocean. I understood that if the fog lasted for a week or 10 days, as it sometimes did, especially at that season of the year, it was a fight for our lives. I soon realized that we were lost and that the fight was on. We were certainly stripped for it, without impedimenta. No anchor, compass, provisions, water, no means of catching fish or fowl, and with rather light clothing as we were dressed for work and not for protection against cold. But youth is optimistic and claims what is coming to it, with a margin for luck, and we started on our new voyage of discovery with good courage and a cheerful disregard of the hardships, dangers, and possible death in the fog with which and into we were drifting. It would not be strictly accurate to say that we saw nothing during all the time we were adrift, but the things we saw were of the same stuff that the fog was made of. Early in the first day, I saw a sail dimly outlined in the misty air. I called John's attention to it with a shout, and he saw it too, but as we rowed toward it, the sail retreated and then disappeared. We thought that this was strange, for the wind was not strong enough to take a vessel away from us faster than we could row, and we were near enough to make ourselves heard. Soon the sail appeared again, and again we shouted and rowed towards it, and again it glided away from us and disappeared. And again, through the seemingly endless procession of slow-moving hours of that first day, we chased the phantom ship. When night came on, there came with it a deepening sense of loneliness and isolation. The night was also very cold. The chill penetrated our thin clothing, and we were compelled to row the boat to keep ourselves not warm, but a little less cold. The icebergs coming down on the Arctic current hold the season back, and early June on the banks is much like April on the Massachusetts coast. We tried to sleep lying down in the bottom of the boat with our heads in a trawl tub, but we were stiff with cold. The boat leaked badly and was necessary to get up frequently and bail out the water. The thought also that we might drift within sight or sound of a vessel or within sight of a trawl buoy made us afraid to sleep. The night finally wore away. The second day and the night were like the first. The third like the first and second, and the fourth day like another cycle of Cathay. These 4 days and nights were like solitary confinement to the prisoner, the grim monotony and lack of incident contributing to the cumulative effect and accentuating the sense of helplessness and isolation. There was nothing to relieve the situation. We were like an army lying in trenches in the face of the enemy, waiting for the enemy's move. The fourth night we were startled by the sound of a foghorn of a sailing vessel. The wind was blowing almost a gale. We listened to get the direction, then sprang to the oars and rowed hard to intercept her, shouting, listening, rowing with all our strength, and willing, if need be, to be run down in the chance of being seen and rescued. The horn finally sounded so near that it seemed we could almost see the vessel, and we felt sure they could hear our call. But our hearts sank as the sounds grew fainter, and soon we were alone again with the wind and fog. The fifth day we heard the whistle of an ocean steamship. We can surely head this one off, we thought, but she quickly passed us, too far away to see or hear. It was a bitter disappointment, as this floating hotel, full of warmth, food, water, shelter, and companionship, for the lack of each and all of which we were perishing, rushed by, so near yet unconscious and unheeding, in too great a hurry to stop and listen to our cry for help. I have thought of this since, as I have hurried along with a crowd in the street of a great city and wondered, if we stopped to listen, what cry might come to us out of the deep. The fifth night the sea was running high. We were drifting again with a trawl tub fastened to the painter, as a drag to keep the boat headed to the wind when it began to rain. I spread my oil jacket to catch the water, and we waited until we could collect enough for a drink, watching the drops eagerly, as we had tasted neither food nor water since leaving the vessel 5 days before. Just as we were about to drink, however, our boat shipped to sea, filling the oil jacket with salt water, and there was no more rain. Every day we passed great flocks of seafowl floating on the water, coming frequently almost within an oar's length, but always just out of reach. We were in worse condition than the ancient mariner, with food as well as water everywhere about us and not a morsel or drop to eat or drink. Thirst is harder to endure than hunger, and yet hunger finally wakes up the wolf, and the time comes when even the thought of cannibalism can be entertained without horror. About this time, John asked me, "Well, what do you think?" "Oh," I said, "I think one of us will come out of it all right." He started as if he thought that I had premature designs on him. "You need not be afraid," I said. "I'll not take advantage of you." He knew that I was the stronger, and perhaps thought that if I felt as he did, his chances were very small. The sixth day, John seemed like a man overwhelmed with the horror of a situation that had gotten beyond his control. He cowered at the opposite end of the boat and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he opened a conversation with a person of whose presence I had not been conscious. "Jim," he said, "come, give me a piece." "Jim who?" I asked. "Piece of what? Where is he?" "Jim Woodbury," he answered. "Don't you see him? There he is, hiding under that oil jacket. He's been there over half an hour eating pie, and he won't give me any." I tried to laugh him out of his delusion, but the thing was real to him. Soon he jumped up and said, "I'm going on board. I'm tired of staying out here." "How will you get there?" I asked. "Walk," he answered. "The water ain't deep." And he started to get overboard. I caught him and pulled him back into the boat, not any too soon. For if he had gone overboard, the sharks would probably have gotten him, for they were not very far away. Every now and then I had seen their fins cutting the surface of the water as they patrolled back and forth, waiting their time or ours, as if they knew that it was only a question of time. Soon John started again to get overboard. This time I punished him so severely that he did not try it again. After that I had to keep my eye on him constantly. His ravings about food were not particularly soothing to my feelings, for I was as hungry as he, only not so demonstrative about it. The seventh day drifted slowly by, and the fog still held us captive. For a week we had had no food, no water, and scarcely any sleep. Having our boots on continuously stopped the circulation in our feet with the same effect as if they had been frozen. We were chilled to the bone. My boatmate was insane. Since the whistle of the steamship had died away in the distance 2 days before, no sound had come to us out of the fog, but the voices of the wind and the swash of the waves. I knew the chart of the banks and had a general idea as to where we were. There is a great barren tract on the banks where few fish are found, and fishermen seldom go, and we had drifted into this man-forsaken place. I had almost said God-forsaken too, but something began to shape itself in my mind about that time. It makes it difficult for me now to say this. Rather, as I look back on our experience, I feel more like claiming fellowship with the wanderer who called this place of his hardship Bethel, because it was there, at the end of self and of favoring conditions, that he found God. The pilot. I was near the end of my rope. I was not frightened or discouraged. My mind was perfectly clear. I was not stampeded. Of course I had thought of God and of prayer, but I was a skeptic, as I supposed, and considered both not proven. But the steady contemplation of the probability of death for 7 successive days under conditions that compelled candor raised questions that skepticism could not answer, and gave to my questions the answer that skepticism could not refute. There comes a time, under such conditions, when common sense asserts itself and sophistry fails to satisfy. Since I made this discovery in my personal experience, I have learned that my case was not peculiar, but in keeping with a general law in human experience, long understood and admirably stated in the 107th Psalm. Such words as these have come out of the depths, and it is sometimes necessary to go down into the depths to prove them to be true. They wandered. In a solitary way they found no city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted in them. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses. And he led them forth by the right way, that they might go to a city of habitation. Such as sit in darkness and in shadow of death, being bound in affliction and iron, because they rebelled against the words of God, and contemned the counsel of the Most High. Therefore he brought down their heart with labor. They fell down, and there was none to help. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them out of their distresses. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and brake their hands in sunder. That they go down to the sea in ships, that they do business in great waters. These see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of the trouble. They are at their wits' ends. Then they cry unto their Lord their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then they are glad, because they be quiet. So he bringeth them unto their desired heaven. I had drifted into the secret place. The door was shut in the right time and place for me to pray. I saw that my life had been a failure, that I was absolutely worthless, and that if death came then, there was not one good thing I'd ever done that would survive. In fact, I could think of nothing in my life that was worth remembering. I was not so much concerned about my own salvation as for another chance to live and to do an unselfish work in the world. And so I did what I thought then and think still was the only sane thing to do. I signaled for the pilot. That night the rain came. I spread my oil jackets and caught an abundance of water, of which we drank deeply. With this refreshment we came new hope and new courage for the final struggle, if safety could be gained that way. I reviewed the situation and considered one by one the possible courses we might take. We seemed to be shut into three things. The first possibility was to row to land. But the nearest land, the Newfoundland coast, was nearly 300 miles away, and I decided that we did not have the time or strength to reach it. The second possibility was to be picked up by a passing vessel, but this did not look encouraging, for two had already passed us. The third and last hope was to find a fishing vessel at anchor and within a reasonable distance. This last possibility seemed almost probable. But how probable? Possibly within 10 miles, probably within 25, certainly within 50. Some fishermen were plying their trade, but where? There are 32 points of the compass, and by deviating one point at the center, a distance of 50 miles would bring us 10 miles out of the way at the circumference. We could row 50 miles, but we cannot take chances. Yet there is a snug little fishing craft out there on the rim of the circle, waiting for us to find her. But which way shall we go? I finally decided that this was a problem for the pilot, and I left it with him, satisfied that he understood his business, and that if he had any orders for me, he knew how to communicate them. The 8th day came, and with it came an impulse to row the boat in a certain direction. This impulse was not unlike the thousands that had come to me before. There was nothing about it to indicate that its source was any higher than my own imagination. If this was a voice from above the fog, it's certainly a still small one. It was unheeded at first, not unrecognized. Reason said that to conserve our strength we should sit still and wait for the lifting of the fog. Fear whispered, that if I obeyed the impulse, we might be rowing directly away from safety. But the impulse persisted and prevailed. "Get up, John," I said. "We have a day's work ahead of us. We are going to row off in this direction." John responded automatically, fear acting in place of reason. But he was soon exhausted and lay down again. I kept on, however, resting now and then and returning to the oars with the thought of that 50 miles was a long distance, and they had a very small margin of time to our credit. Our course was with the wind, and nature worked with us all that 8th day and on into the night, as the pressure on me drove us towards our goal. About the middle of the 8th night, I realized that I had reached the limit of my fighting strength. John was in worse condition than I, for I still had hope. But my hope was not in myself. Then I talked the situation over with the pilot. We had nowhere else to go. We had come as far as we could. Our time was nearly up. What of the night? And what of the morning? John was asleep. The world was a long way off. The sea and the mist seemed to have rolled over us and have buried us 10,000 fathoms deep. But out of the depths I cried, and I found the communication open. Between midnight and dawn the fog lifted, and from the overhanging clouds the rain fell gently through the remainder of the night. John lay in his head of the boat, but I sat watching. Finally, as if in response to some secret signal, the darkness began its inevitable retreat, and as the night horizon receded, out of the grey of the morning, growing more and more distinct as the shadows fell away, appeared a dark object less than 2 miles distant. Nebulous at first, then unmistakable in its character. It was a solitary fishing vessel lying at anchor, towards which we had been rowing and drifting unerringly all through the night and the day before. There it was. Only a clumsy old fisherman, but it was the best thing in all the world to us, and it was anchored and could not get away. I do not recall the experience of any tumultuous emotion as this messenger of hope appeared on our horizon, but I knew that we were safe. How easy it is to write the simple word of 4 letters, but to realize it, one must have a background of despair. Since that morning, the words safe, safety, salvation have always come to me freighted with that reality. It is doubtful if any of the vessel's crews had seen our boat, as it was scarcely daylight and such a small object lying close to the water would not be readily discernible. I had thought a few hours before that my strength was entirely exhausted, but the sight of the vessel called out a sufficient reserve for the final effort. As I slowly brought our boat alongside, some of the crew were in evidence, getting ready for the day's work, and they seemed perplexed to account for our early morning call. But when we came close to the vessel, our emaciated appearance evidently told the main outlines of our story. They called to the others in a foreign tongue, and the whole crew crowded to the rail. One strong fellow jumped into our boat and lifted John up, while others reached down to help. Then, with their assistance, I tumbled on board, stiff with cold and with feet like stone. They gave us brandy and took us to the warm cabin where breakfast was being prepared, and it is difficult to say which was more grateful, the smell of food or the warmth of the fire. John was put into the captain's bunk. It was a good exchange, for he was not far off from Davy Jones's locker. We had been on board only a few hours when the fog rolled back again and continued for some time afterward. The vessel was a French fishing brig from the island of St. Malo in the English Channel. None of the crew understood English, and neither of us could speak French, but they understood the language of distress, and kindness needs no interpreter. The captain showed me a calendar and pointed to the 10th of June, and when I pointed to the 2nd, he evidently found it hard to believe me. But John's condition helped to corroborate my statement. They let us eat as much as we wished, but nature protected us, for the process of eating was so painful at first that it felt like a sword swallower who had partaken too freely of his favorite dish. Fortunately also, our hosts were living the simple life. Their menu consisted chiefly of sliced bread over which had been poured the broth of fish cooked in water and light wine. The same fish cooked in oil as a second course, bread and hardtack, and an occasional dish of beans, which seemed to be regarded by them as a luxury. They had an abundance of beer and light wine, and in the morning before going to haul their trawls, coffee was served with brandy. Cooking was done on a brick platform or fireplace in the cabin, and the captain, the mate, and all hands sat around one large dish placed on the cabin floor, and each helped himself with his own spoon. A loaf of bread was passed around, each cutting off a slice with his own sheath knife. But notwithstanding simple food, frugal meals, and primitive conditions, the hospitality was genuine, and against the background of our recent hunger, thirst, and general wretchedness, the place was heaven, and our hosts were angels in thin disguise. In about 10 days we were brought to St. Pierre, the French fishing town on a small rocky island of Miquelon off the Newfoundland coast, the depot of the French fishing fleet and the only remaining foothold for the French of the vast empire once held by them between the North Atlantic and the Mississippi Valley. The American consul took us in charge and sending us to a sailor's boarding house and giving each of us a change of clothing. In another week we were sent on by steamer to Halifax, consigned to the American consul at that port. There John's feet proved to be in such bad condition that it was necessary to send him to the hospital, and as gangrene had set in, a portion of each foot was amputated. He was queer for several weeks, but with returning physical health gradually recovered his mental equilibrium. After a few days in Halifax, I was sent on by steamer to Boston, bringing the first news of either our loss or our rescue. On reaching my hometown, I did not go to a boarding house. There was plenty of room for me in the home, and I was contented to stay there for a while. The old salts received me as a long-lost brother, and while the official notice was never handed me, I was made to feel that somewhere in the inner consciousness I had been elected a regular member of the Amalgamated Society of Sea Dogs, and was entitled to an inside seat, if I could find one, about the stove of any shoemaker shop in the cove. The banks were revisited in memory, and all the old fog experiences were brought out, amplified and elongated as far as possible. But it was conceded that we had established a new record in the nautical traditions of the cove. It took several years for me to inch my way back to physical solvency from the effects of my exposure, and this delayed the carrying out of my plans, to which my fishing trips had been a prelude. The strange thing that now I have to record is that I soon forgot, or willfully ignored, my whole experience of God, prayer, and deliverance, and became apparently more skeptical and indifferent than before. The only way I can explain this is that I had not become a Christian, and that my dominant mental attitude asserted itself when danger was past. I practically never attended church. My position and influence, however, were not merely negative. I was positively antagonistic to Christianity, and this attitude continued up to the April following. But while I forgot, I was not forgotten. God had begun a work in me, the continuation and completion of which waited on my willingness to cooperate. And the most powerful force in the world, that of believing in persistent prayer, was being released in my behalf. My mother was a woman of remarkable Christian character, with rare qualities of mind and heart, knowledge and love of the Scriptures, and a deep and genuine prayer life. Notwithstanding my lack of sympathy with her in the things most fundamental, she had confidence that the tide would turn in me. Her confidence, however, was not based on me. She knew the Lord and understood that it was not the sheep that went out after the shepherd who was lost until it found him. So she kept a well-worn path to the place of prayer. She was wise and said little to me on the subject, but I knew her life for what it was, for which she was most deeply solicitous. She had taught me from the Bible as a boy in many a cold winter night. Though weary with a day filled with household cares, she had come to my room and tucked me in with prayer. My attitude towards Christianity in the winter following my second fishing trip on the Newfoundland banks was different from that of the year before. Then I'd been a skeptic, as I assumed, and declined responsibility for what to me was unknown and seemed to be unknowable. But in the meantime, something had happened that had lifted this whole question with me from the realm of speculation to that of experience. The pilot's response to my signal might for the time be ignored, but it could not be forgotten. But by deliberately putting aside my convictions of God, prayer and deliverance, treating them as if they had no existence in fact, I had introduced an element of distrust with my own mental processes. The will had taken the place of judgment, and the result was confusion. I was in the fog. I never attended prayer meeting, but one Sunday night I was passing the chapel where such a meeting was being held. I had been there with my mother as a boy, and while the meetings were slow, they were pervaded with a true devotional spirit, and something real, though to me intangible and difficult to describe. Whether I was influenced by the memory of these boyhood glimpses into the spiritual world, or by the spirit of the scoffer and the cynic possessing me at the time, or by the little small voice that had pointed the way to safety only a few months before, I never knew fully, but I went in. And I think that's where we're going to call it tonight. If you'd like to pick up this story where it's left off, you can find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music is Un Désert by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.